Today we're going to build this classic 3-panel solid core door using nothing but construction lumber and basic tools. And it's going to be pretty easy. So let's get to it. So before we begin, I'm just going to go over a quick outline of what we're going to make, the pieces we'll need, materials, etc., etc. So you can see here is the rough drawing, not to scale of course, of the shaker style door. We've got what are going to be 4 rails and 2 stiles. Traditionally the bottom rail is thicker than the top rails. It's just a style choice. You can make it bigger or thicker if you want to, or not. In my case, the bottom rail is going to be 6 3/4 inches, while the top 3 are all going to be 5 inches. Most interior doors are 1 3/4 inches thick. I would suggest measuring before you make a door that's too thick and doesn't fit. I would also suggest measuring your existing door before you make one, assuming that it's a standard size. I did, and the height of my existing door is 79 1/4 inches, while it's 28 inches wide. I've chosen to make my stiles 5 inches each. So 28 minus 10 inches, you know, the width of the 2 stiles gives us 18 inches, which is going to be the width of our inner panels. I also went for a rectangular panel. You can of course make these in any particular layout you want. Shape and width wise, this was just a design that I liked and it looked good in the pictures that I've seen. Each of these rails is going to be roughly shaped like this. So you're going to have your visible portion of the rail, and then you're going to have a 1.5 inch tenon out of each side. These middle 2 rails will have a trough or mortise on both sides so that the panel can slide in to each side of it. The top and the bottom one, of course, only need a corresponding mortise on the inner sides to accept the top and the bottom of the top and bottom panel, respectively. Materials wise, it's pretty basic. You need 1 2x8 by 8 for this bottom rail. If you could find a 2x8 by 6, that would be even better because you really only need 28 inches of it. That being said, if you're making more than one door, which you likely are because you probably want all your doors to match, you can get a couple doors out of a 2x8 by 8, so you're going to need more of them anyways. 3 2x6 by 8s. This will make up 1 2x6 for each of the 2 stiles, and then the remaining one you cut up into 3 pieces to make up the top 3 rails. And then in my case, I've chosen to use MDF for the inner panels. So you're going to need 1 sheet, which is going to be 4x8 by half of MDF to make these. Could you use plywood? Absolutely you could, but with the absolutely crazy COVID pricing on lumber, it honestly didn't make sense to. MDF paints up much smoother and nicer in my opinion than plywood does anyways. And in this case, there's no chance of it warping or moving either. And because it's a composite product, you can glue your panels into the rails and stiles, which will again make the door more rigid. If you chose to make your panels out of strips of wood glued together, you of course would leave them loose to allow them to expand and contract. Also, if you're going to use plywood for these, which if I was going to make it for say like an exterior door or somewhere in a very, very moist or wet location, might not be a bad idea, you could absolutely do that. I have already made one of these and put it in my bathroom, and there's no issue with the MDF. Once it's painted, it is more than waterproof enough for an interior application. And it's more than strong enough too. And it's cheap, and like I said, it paints up quite nicely. It is the material in my case of choice for these. So a basic overview of the tools that I'll be using for this project are a radial alarm saw. I'll be using a dado stack, a thickness planer, which I obviously don't have sitting on top of my workbench here, and because I don't have a jointer, I'll be using this level, and I'll show you how you can joint all of your lumber nice and straight using this, which is relatively cheap and easy. So with that, that's more or less all of the preamble. Let's start making some sawdust. Now, the reason I'm using construction lumber for this project is, as I mentioned earlier, the COVID lumber prices are still with us and they're still crazy. At least around me. So if you can get yourself some nice clear oak, fir, or something more reasonable, by all means do so. In my case, if I use anything other than construction grade lumber, it becomes cheaper just to buy a hollow core door from Home Depot. In my case, I want to make them. They're better doors anyways. You make them yourself, they're solid. And so that's what I'll be working with. Being as it's construction grade lumber, it's going to be full of knots and other defects. So what I like to do first is I cut all my pieces to rough length before I plane them, before I joint them or anything like that. I cut them down to the lengths I need, plus about an inch. That way I can play with it a little bit. It gives me a little bit of chip out and just room on each end to play with. So first things first, we're going to cut both the rails and stiles all to rough length. So with our pile of lumber rough cut, our two stiles, and our rails, it's now time to joint them straight. So I'll show you how to do that with a level. So the way we're going to make this work is we're going to utilize a straight edge, in this case a 78-inch level, as well as the fact that on a radial arm saw, if you've made your table correctly, the front surface is exactly parallel to the back surface, which means it's exactly parallel to your fence. So what we're going to do, take our straight edge, and take our board to be jointed. I like to see which edge is rougher, and I like to take my first cut off that side. It's just going to be a graze pass to start with. So we're going to clamp our level to the better side so that the level just overhangs the outside here. And that's just to give us a little bit more stability. You'll see why this is important in a minute. But you want this side as wide as you possibly can. And you also want your straight edge as close to parallel with the outside edge or with the board as you can to begin with. And then you're going to clamp it on. So as you can see, what this is going to let us do is place our board to be jointed onto our cutting surface, and we're going to slide it along. And as we do so, it's going to carry on in this direction, exactly parallel, because it's riding along the level on the front of the saw. It's going to mimic that cut on this side, so you're going to get a perfectly straight edge, or at least an edge that is as straight as your straight edge. So having something like a level that is nice and straight is important in this case. So now that all of our pieces have at least one straight edge, I'm going to rip them all down to their width of 5 inches for all except for the bottom, which, as in our drawing, gets the 6 3/4 width. I'm not going to take it off in one pass. Most of these boards have defects and other things in them, so you might have to take a little bit from each side to get the correct dimension and to try to eliminate as many of the defects as possible. Don't worry too much if you can't get rid of all of them. We have ways of hiding those later on in the finishing stages, and it'll look just fine either way. Of course, your first pass, as I'm sure you know, has to be on the side opposite that you jointed so that you can run your jointed edge along your fence. So I'm going to cut all these down to their final dimension, width-wise, and then we can get down to planning them. Here we go. So now, with all of our various pieces planed down to the correct thickness, in this case, like I mentioned earlier, 1 3/8 inches, as well as squared off on both sides, it is now time to cut our channel down the middle so that we can piece these all together. Keep in mind and remember that the top and the bottom of the two rails, well, the top and bottom two rails rather, will only have a groove on one side, whereas the middle two get it on both sides. So now that it's come time to cut the grooves into our stiles and rails, we've had to change our setup somewhat. So as you can see here, I've changed over to my other radial arm saw. You don't need two, but in this case, the reason I'm using this one for this part of the procedure is I don't have a shaper guard for my other one, and frankly having that much exposed blade is unsafe and rather nerve-wracking to work around, even if you found a safe way to do it. You can see that I put my board buddies on here. These are one-way rollers that both push down and push the wood in against the fence, so it keeps it nice and flat and doesn't keep it from going anywhere, and because they're one way, they also help to prevent kickback. I have a 1/2 inch dado stack mounted to this, which of course is the dimension we want for our tenons as well. When you run through making your groove, you run it through once, then you flip it end over end, and you run it through a second time. That way, if your blade is a little bit to the top or a little bit to the bottom of center, when you run it through twice, you erase that error and you get a perfectly centered channel. I'd recommend testing your setup a few times on a piece of scrap that's the same dimensions, or at least the same thickness as the pieces that we're using. That way you can adjust the height of your setup to get the width of your groove exactly the same as the MDF. You want it to be just snug, not tight. If it's too tight, when you try and assemble everything later, you're in for a bear of a time, especially with the glue in there. You want it to just slide together nicely without any slop. So with all of that in mind, let's make some grooves. So here I'm clamping a stop block to my fence. Anytime I'm making a number of pieces that are all the same and I want to be exactly the same size, such as the rails for the door, it just makes repetitive cuts much more precise. You'll also see here, before I make the final cut to length on this stile, that I just take a thin sliver off of the end of it. Once you've jointed your board straight, it's always a good idea to take a thin sliver off one side before you measure it out to do your final length cut. That way your end of the board is square to the side that you've jointed. The ends on constructions or lumber aren't always as square as you need them to be, so it's just a quick step that solves that issue. So now that we have all the mortises or grooves carved through all of our pieces, it's time for us to cut the tenons on each of our each of our rails that will fit into the corresponding grooves to hold our door together. So I've marked this one, as you can see here, with the length that I want the tenon to be. Now you'll remember that we made our mortises on these 1.5 inches deep. I'm choosing to make the tenons 1 7/16 inches. That gives us a 1/16 of an inch on each side of wiggle room. Otherwise, what can happen is your tenon will hit the bottom of the mortise first before it sits flush, and you'll end up with a gap, and you'll end up having to trim it anyways. This gives you that little bit of wiggle room, and it'll just make your life easier. What I've also done is marked out on this side the size of the tenon that I want. So what we'll be doing is we'll be cutting away this outer portion on each side, giving us the tenon that we want. To cut the tenon, I've outfitted the radial arm saw with my dado stack once again. You could absolutely use a standard blade to do this and just make a whole bunch of passes all the way along. This just takes out a wider swath and makes it go faster. What I'll also be utilizing is a stop block. So I'm going to set this up again just as I did before, so that when I have my tenon in the correct spot, I'll clamp this on here so that all of my tenons will come up and hit this. They'll all stop in the same spot and they'll all be exactly the same length. So you can see me here just making a small pass at the end of my first rail. This lets me test the width, or at least I should say the thickness of one of my tenons. So I just take 2 small passes to the very end, and I double check that it fits nice and snugly into the groove that are on one of my stiles. That way if I need to make any adjustments, it's very easy, and it'll be in a spot that no one will ever see it. Once that's done, I can set up my stop block so that once again my tenons are all the same length, and then I can proceed to cut them all out. So with the rails and stiles all mortise and tenoned and ready to go, all we have left is to cut the panels. Not a lot to these really, you're just really cutting a rectangle out of MDF. Same thing though as with the tenons, I'm going to make these a 1/16 short on each side, so an 1/8 in each dimension. Again, just so that it fits without any interference or with a little bit of play and tolerance. So let's do it. One other note before we do this, MDF dust is particularly bad for your health, and this stuff does make a lot of it. That is the downside to working with MDF, so I would recommend that you wear a mask while you're cutting it. So now, with all the parts cut out, the stiles, the rails, and the panels, comes the part of dry assembly. It's exactly what it sounds like, and if you've made all the cuts right, it should just glide together. So here we go. So once you've got it all dry fit together, don't worry if you've got a couple little ridges where your pieces come together. A light sand will blend all of that together. And likewise, don't fret if you have a tiny gap here or there. A little bit of wood filler won't be an issue in this case anyways. I'm painting these all white, so you won't see any gaps. Obviously try not to have any, it makes life way easier later on, but filler is not the enemy here. Obviously if you're making a stain grade door, that would be different, but if you're making a stained grade door, you also wouldn't be using MDF panels, so that's not really the case here. Once you've got it all fitted together, and it all seems reasonable, I like to number all of my pieces. So I'll put for example, a 1 on each of the 3 pieces here, the panel, the stile, and the rail. Just so that those 3 fit together the same orientation. I find often that once you've had something all fitted together nicely the way you want it, when you take it apart and go to glue it back together, if you flip a piece around or something, things don't quite fit together the same way. So you want to glue it together the same way that you dry fit it together. That way you know that you'll end up with the product that you've laid out and that you want it to be. So at this point, it's time that we had a chat about wood glue. So this, of course, is your standard carpenter's glue that I've used for many, many years. However, the problem with this is it has an open time of about 5 minutes. I found this to be quite a stretch on the last door that I made. You simply can't get your door glued together and aligned fast enough before this starts to set up and make life difficult. This is Titebond Extend, which has an open time of, I believe, 30 minutes. So it gives you, literally 6 times the length of time to get your door assembled and together. So this is what I'm going to use, and this is also what I would suggest you use to glue your door together. So I'm going to go glue everything up. I'm not going to bother showing that because you saw me put it together with the dry fit, and it's literally exactly the same thing. So when we cut back, it'll all be glued together. So once I have the door all glued together and it's set up, I like to start the next day by giving it a sand. There's usually some irregularities where the pieces come together, like the rails and the stiles, just because it is construction lumber and it's not always perfectly flat, or sometimes it has a slight cup to it. Nothing that prevents the door from being functional and looking good, but it does create a slight lip occasionally where the 2 pieces come together. You want to get the whole door as smooth as possible at this point before we move on to fixing any of the other imperfections, just so that you really know what you're working with and what you might have to fix. So once the dust is settled from your initial sanding, getting everything all nice and smooth and even, it's time for a little bit of filler. Now, a quick word on fillers. The 2 we'll be using for this project are some Drydex Pink Spackle. This stuff you've probably seen everywhere. You'll use it to patch the drywall, to fill furniture, to all kinds of stuff. And then we have actual wood filler. For the bigger holes, the knots, anything where there's actually, a crack, an indentation, maybe a gap between a rail and a stile, fill with this first, sand it smooth, and then we're going to prime it. And then anything that shows through the primer, we'll use the spackle on. This stuff really doesn't like being spread any more than a millimeter thick, and even that is a little questionable. You really want to get this stuff just to take out those little imperfections that show through the paint. Anything more than that, you want to use the wood filler before paint. So as an example, for the stuff that we're looking to fill, we've got this knot here. You can see that it has an actual little hole to it, a little bit of a crack. So we're just take a little bit of that filler and work it in there. Another example of a spot, you can see we have just a little bit of an open gap between the rail and the stile here. So that too, we're just going to work a little bit of this into. And likewise, we're going to go around the entire door and fill anything that's an imperfection. So as you can see here, most of the knots got a little bit of filler on them just to scrape the surface and to smooth them out and fill any little gaps and cracks that are in them. So we'll let that set up, and then we'll give them a sand smooth, and then we'll move on to our first coat of primer. So it's the next day, and I've given it another once over with the sander to take all of the filler and wood glue and anything else that's left over down smooth. Don't worry too much if there's still an imperfection here or there in like a divot of some sort. Anything that's small will get with the spackle after the coat of primer. You do want to make sure though that any ridges or any raised spots have been brought down flat, because this is your last opportunity to fix that sort of thing. From this point forward, we can only fill divots, otherwise you have to sand through the primer and that's going to be a nightmare. So let's get the first coat of primer on it and we'll go from there. It's at this moment that we need to talk about a sealer primer. So, because we're using cheap lumber, there are pitch pockets and knots and tannins that will come through any sort of paint that you put over this. It's really important that you use a sealing primer, otherwise, like I said, your finished product, the sap and colors such as tannins in the wood will actually bleed through your finished coat of paint on it, which will ruin your day, because you'll have a beautiful looking door one day, and the next day you'll come up and you'll see little beads of sap that have poked their way through the finish. And it's rather demoralizing. So what you need to do is get yourself a sealer primer. In this case, I'm using Zinsser Bin, which has been the standard for pretty much freaking forever. It's a shellac-based primer, and it's designed to hide and seal anything in. It even says on the can directly for tannins and sap. So this is what you're going to want to put your first coat over your door with. After this, we'll be moving on to a cabinet paint, which I'll talk more about later. So there's nothing super special here. Follow the instructions in the can. I'm just going to put the first coat down with a brush and make sure to stir it up really, really well. And that's all there really is to it. I'll bring it back when there's a coat of paint on it. So now with 2 coats of primer on the door, which doesn't take long at all. That bin primer I used is the consistency of milk once you mix it up, and it dries in about 15 minutes. You can recoat it within half an hour. It'll take you no time at all. So what I've done is I've taken my spackle and I've gone over the door, and any little imperfections that were left, any little slight textured areas or pinholes around knots or anything like that, I put a little bit over it. Takes no time at all to fill it, and that way it won't seed anymore. What I've also done is right here you can see I had it was actually just a pitch seam that was right near the surface, so the primer didn't stick to it or didn't cover it. It was slightly above the wood, I suppose. So I just took a chisel and carved it out, scraped all the pitch out of it. I'll put a little filler in there, and then we'll be ready to put the coat of finish paint on the door. One suggestion I would make before you paint your door is that you fit it first. And by that I mean take it to your door opening, hang it up, and make sure that you don't need to trim it one way or the other and that it fits nicely in the opening. To do that, obviously, you'll need to make the recesses for your hinges to fit into the door. While you can do this the old-fashioned way with a hammer and chisel and neatly notch out the recess for the hinges, I would strongly suggest that you spend the $30 and you buy a couple jigs. This one is for the hinges. It clamps over the side of the door, like so. It comes with a router bit, as well as a special drill bit for centering and drilling the screw holes for the hinges. So this would be about $30 Canadian, which is nothing if you're making more than one of these doors. For one door, yeah, you could probably get away without it. Any more than that, I would strongly suggest going this route, because it's perfect every time. While it does add a small amount of cost, you can pick up a used router on Craigslist for less than $50. It really doesn't have to be anything special to make this work. Likewise, I would suggest also buying the matching jig for drilling out the holes for the handle and latch. This is particularly clever. It clamps over the door when you have it hanging in the doorway, and using this tab it lines it up with the part that the striker sits into. So it puts your door handle at exactly the right height for your door frame. It also comes with both the bits you need to drill both your holes for the actual latch part and for the doorknob mechanism. For the small outlay cost, I highly recommend picking up a pair of these. To mark out where the hinges go on your new door, I typically bring the old door down to the workshop. I lay it down next to the new door, and then I use a square to transfer the marks for the edges of the hinges onto the new door. Then of course, you take your jig, put it onto what would be your new door, line it all up, tighten it onto the door, grab your router, away you go. And they're each perfect 100% of the time. As mentioned earlier, this jig, however, do not do while your door is out of the door frame. This one, like I said, centers itself on the door strike. That way it's at the right height exactly for your door, and that way there's no guessing. So save this one for once it's hanging in the door frame. Interjecting here to before you paint your door, what I like to do is I like to take a bit of silicone and I like to put a small bead just around the inside corner all the way around on the panels. That way if there's any slight gap or any imperfection in that joint between your panel and your rails or stiles, this fills the gap. I just use a tube of paintable silicone, works perfect, and it makes it look ideal. That way there's a perfect smooth edge and it looks exactly fitted the way it should have been from the start. So I put that around it, smooth it off with your finger, and then let it dry and paint it, and it just finishes it off very nicely. So with the door now primed and all the imperfections filled, we're finally ready for paint. Now, do not, under any circumstances, paint your door with regular latex paint. I've done it before, and what you'll find happens is A, it stays very soft, so anytime someone bumps into the door with anything or when you're moving through it, you'll leave marks, gouges, scrapes, and marks all over the door. And also what you'll find is if you close your door for the first, I don't know, month or so, your door will stick shut. And when you open it, the paint in the door jamb will stick to the paint on the door, and when you open it, it'll peel chunks off the door. What you really want to use is a proper cabinet enamel. So in this case, I'm using a Behr Premium Cabinet and Trim Enamel. I've had very good luck with this paint. I know lots of people also like the Sherwin-Williams cabinet paints. I've also had excellent luck with Benjamin Moore paints in general, although I've not used their cabinet paint, so I can't say for sure. But this Behr stuff is available at Home Depot everywhere, which means it's pretty much available to anybody that's trying to find it with very little issue any day of the week. It dries within 2 hours, often less, so recoating in one day isn't hard to do at all. It levels very nicely. So application-wise, I've put on with a brush, I've put on with a roller. Don't use a microfiber roller, although a lot of people seem to like them for trim and cabinets. I find they leave a lot of little particles behind no matter how many times you wash them beforehand or prepare them. The foam cabinet rollers will give you a much smoother, more factory-like finish than anything else. Even just using a brush, if you're fine with your strokes and you use a good brush, it levels out really nicely and you won't have any of that stippled, rolled look at all, or any brush strokes even. It'll look really good. In my case, I bought myself a new toy, this Wagner Flexio 5000 sprayer. So I'm going to try spraying this door, which is why you see this shower curtain hanging behind me to catch the overspray. I'm doing a whole bunch of these doors and a whole bunch of cabinets in my home, so for me, I'm hoping the sprayer will speed things along a bit and give me just that little bit finer finish in the future. We'll try it and find out, and if it's any good, I'll do a review on it later on. As far as prepping the door for paint, I'm going to give it a wipe off with some mineral spirits, just to take any dust or any other dirt that happened to get on it off. And then it should be good to go. I don't know how much of this I'm going to be able to get to show you, because again, I have to protect everything around me from overspray, and that includes my camera and camera lens. Hopefully I can find a spot or an angle where you can watch me spray it. If not, we'll be back after a couple coats of paint. And that, in a nutshell, is how you make yourself a 3-panel door out of nothing but construction grade lumber for relatively cheap, at least much cheaper than it would cost you to buy a solid core 3-panel door. And if you watch my previous video, you'll also be able to make the crown molding and the casings also from cheap department store lumber for all your doors, so that they look framed out and perfect and cost you a fraction of the price.